Tonight, we take a calm journey through the life of Abraham Lincoln, the humble rail splitter who rose from a log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness to become America's 16th president. His life was a story of pain and perseverance, of learning and leading, and of holding together a nation on the brink of collapse. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, let the room grow quiet, and breathe deeply. If you enjoy slow, reflective storytelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. These stories may be made to soothe the mind, but they often awaken something deeper, a quiet connection to the past. Our story begins in the still hills of Kentucky. On a cold February morning in 1809, in a one-room log cabin near the small town of Hodgenville, a child was born into poverty. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He entered the world with nothing but the will to live and a sky full of promise. His family was poor, so poor that even a candle was a rare luxury. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a stern carpenter and farmer who believed in hard work and discipline. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was soft-spoken and deeply spiritual. From her, Abraham inherited a quiet soul and a reflective mind that stayed with him for life. The Lincolns moved often, searching for better land and opportunity, first within Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. The land was untamed, the winters harsh, and survival never guaranteed. Every fence they built and field they cleared was a small victory against the wilderness. But when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother fell ill with milk sickness, a deadly disease from poisoned milk. She died quickly, leaving a silence that echoed in the small cabin. The loss left a mark on young Lincoln's heart, a grief that never truly faded, a quiet sadness that would become part of who he was. Light returned to his home when his father remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a kind widow who brought warmth, stability, and books into the Lincoln household. She noticed the boy's curiosity, the way his eyes lit up when he read. While his father wanted him to swing an axe, Sarah encouraged him to open a book. Abraham had little schooling, but a boundless hunger to learn. He devoured any book he could find, sometimes walking miles to borrow one. In those candle-lit nights, reading by the faint glow of flame, the boy from the frontier began to shape the mind that would one day guide a nation. He grew up surrounded by long winters and deep forests, a quiet, slow life where thoughts had room to breathe. While other boys hunted or fought, Abraham was often found under a tree reading. His education came not from teachers, but from books, the Bible, Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, and later Shakespeare. He read them until he knew them by heart. His stepmother saw in him a sacred hunger for understanding. Yet his father didn't quite understand his son's obsession with words. He valued muscle over mind, but Abraham's spirit was restless. He dreamed of a life beyond the cabin, beyond the fields. Neighbors found him strange, tall, awkward, and quiet, yet remarkably strong. He could out-wrestle any man in the county and then quote poetry by the fire. Beneath his calm exterior was a growing vision of something larger. He once said, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who will get me a book I ain't read." Those words became a reflection of who he was, endlessly curious, deeply thoughtful, and quietly determined. By his early 20s, Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, lean, rugged, and dressed in clothes that never quite fit. In 1831, he arrived in New Salem, Illinois, a small frontier town. He had no money, no connections, and no plan. Yet people were drawn to him. He worked as a store clerk and became known for his honesty, walking miles to return a few forgotten pennies. That integrity earned him the nickname Honest Abe, but his charm went beyond honesty. He was a storyteller, gifted with humor and timing. He could turn the simplest tale into a moment of laughter or reflection. In 1832, he ran for the state legislature and lost. But 2 years later, he tried again and won. In between, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War, not as a soldier, but as a captain elected by his peers, proof of how naturally people trusted him. In New Salem, Abraham Lincoln found his voice. The quiet boy who once read by firelight had become a man others listened to. After New Salem, Lincoln set his sights on a new goal, the law. Without a degree or teacher, he studied alone, reading borrowed law books late into the night. In 1836, He passed the Illinois bar exam and became a licensed attorney. He moved to Springfield, a town alive with politics and ambition. There he built his legal career, taking on every kind of case, from debts to murder trials. He earned a reputation as a fair, skillful lawyer who never humiliated his opponents. His arguments were simple, his humor well-timed, and his sense of justice unmistakable. But Springfield gave him more than a career. It gave him Mary Todd, a sharp, educated woman from a wealthy family. Their love was fiery and complicated, full of passion and distance. They married in 1842 and had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. 2 of them, Edward and Willie, died young, leaving deep sorrow in their home. Lincoln carried those losses like invisible scars, often retreating into quiet reflection. Friends said sadness followed him like a shadow, never far behind. Still, he moved forward. Through grief and doubt, he held fast to his belief in fairness and human dignity. The law, he realized, was not just about arguments. It was about people, about what was right and what was just. By the 1850s, America itself was breaking apart under the weight of slavery. It called itself the land of liberty, yet millions were enslaved. The debate was no longer just political. It was moral, it was human. And as the nation fractured, the quiet, thoughtful man from the frontier, who once read by candlelight in a log cabin, was preparing to face his greatest test. Would you like me to continue this story up to his presidency and the Civil War in the same tone? It was a time when America was facing an identity crisis, a nation divided against itself, uncertain of its own future. And into this storm stepped a man who had once been little more than a one-term congressman, Abraham Lincoln. At first, Lincoln wasn't loud in his opposition to slavery. He detested it, calling it morally wrong, but he didn't see himself as a radical or a crusader. What he did believe, firmly and without hesitation, was that slavery should not be allowed to spread. That conviction, quiet but unshakable, pulled him back into public life. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, giving new territories the right to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. To Lincoln, this wasn't simply bad lawmaking. It was a betrayal of the very principles on which America had been founded. And so he began to speak again. At first his words were measured and cautious, but as the years passed they grew stronger, more confident and filled with purpose. Then came 1858, and with it, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was a skilled and confident senator, smooth, persuasive, and experienced. Lincoln, on the other hand, was plain-looking, tall, and unrefined. Yet when the 2 men met in 7 open-air debates across Illinois, Lincoln astonished the crowds. He didn't raise his voice or attack his opponent. Instead, he reasoned calmly and spoke with conviction. He asked a question that would echo through time. Can a nation remain half slave and half free? Lincoln didn't think it could. He lost that Senate race but won something far greater, the nation's attention. Newspapers across the country reprinted his speeches. People who had never met him began to talk about the tall lawyer from Illinois, who spoke with uncommon honesty and moral strength. By 1860, that same man was being considered for the highest office in the land. The Republican Party saw in Lincoln something unique, a leader who opposed slavery not with hatred, but with reason and compassion. He wasn't the favorite at first, but in a deeply divided nation, he emerged as the one man capable of holding people together. On a cold November night in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. The victory sent shockwaves through the South. Before he could even take office, Southern states began to secede one by one. The Union itself was unraveling. And though he had yet to step inside the White House, Lincoln was already stepping into history. When he took the oath of office in March 1861, 7 states had already broken away. More would follow. They saw his presidency as a threat to their very way of life, particularly the institution of slavery. Lincoln didn't want war. He wanted unity. But when Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter in April, war became unavoidable. He had never commanded troops, never studied warfare, yet the fate of the nation now rested on his shoulders. He learned as he went, reading military books late into the night, consulting generals by day, and making decisions that would shape the future. Often in solitude and doubt, The Civil War was long, bloody, and brutal. Every battle left behind fields soaked with blood and homes filled with grief. Young boys marched off to war and never returned. Brothers fought brothers. It was no longer a political conflict. It was a human tragedy. Lincoln faced relentless criticism. Newspapers mocked him. Rivals called him a tyrant. Even his own cabinet members questioned his choices. He dismissed general after general, searching desperately for one who could end the bloodshed. In 1862, tragedy struck closer to home. His beloved son Willie died of typhoid fever inside the White House. Lincoln, already burdened by sorrow, was shattered. He would often visit his son's tomb at night, standing alone in silence. Yet even in grief he carried on. Then, in the middle of the war, Lincoln made one of the boldest decisions in American history. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate territories were now free. It didn't end slavery immediately, but it transformed the war's purpose, from preserving a union to redeeming a nation's soul. If slavery is not wrong, Lincoln said, nothing is wrong. From that moment, Lincoln was no longer fighting only to win a war. He was fighting to redefine what America meant. As the war dragged on, Lincoln came to understand something profound, that battles might save a country's body, but words could save its soul. In November 1863, standing on the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, he gave one of the most important speeches in human history. The main orator spoke for over 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for just 2 minutes, 272 words that would echo forever. 77 years ago, he began, reminding the crowd that the nation had been founded on equality and liberty. He spoke not of vengeance or victory, but of renewal, of ensuring that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. At first, his speech drew little reaction, but in time those words became sacred, carved into monuments, recited in schools, and remembered as the moral heartbeat of the American experiment. In a time of chaos, Lincoln brought calm. In a time of hate, he offered dignity. By early 1865, the end of the war was near. The Union Army was closing in. Cities had fallen, and the Confederacy was collapsing. Yet Lincoln did not rejoice. His face was lined, his hair gone gray, his body thin and weary. The war had taken everything from him, but not his compassion. In his second inaugural address, he spoke not as a conqueror, but as a healer. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, urging Americans to bind the nation's wounds and care for all who had suffered. It was a speech of forgiveness, humble, gracious, and deeply human. Just weeks later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was finally over. The Union had been saved. Slavery, the great evil that had divided the nation, was ending. Bells rang. Crowds cheered. There was joy, relief, and hope. Lincoln began planning for peace, a new America rebuilt on freedom and compassion. But fate had other plans. Just 5 days later, on the night of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the president's box and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15th, with his wife Mary at his side. When Abraham Lincoln died, the country didn't just lose a president, it lost its moral compass. News of his death spread like a cold wind across the land. Bells tolled for hours. Cities fell silent. Even his critics mourned him, realizing that in losing Lincoln, they had lost the steady hand that had guided them through their darkest storm. He had seen the war's end, but not the peace that followed. Yet his spirit, humble, thoughtful, and unyielding, remained. Lincoln had not only saved a nation, he had redefined what it meant to be one. After Abraham Lincoln's passing, his body was placed aboard a grand funeral train that made its slow journey from Washington, D.C., all the way to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the winding route, thousands of Americans gathered beside the tracks. Men removed their hats in silent respect. Women held their children close, whispering prayers. As the black train rolled through towns and fields, it wasn't just a funeral procession. It was a nation saying farewell to the man who had held it together through its darkest hour. When the train finally reached Springfield, Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, not far from where he had once walked the streets as a humble young lawyer. His grave would soon be marked by a towering monument, a symbol of gratitude and remembrance. Years later, his likeness would be carved into the stone of Mount Rushmore, and his image printed on money that would pass through millions of hands. But behind all those monuments and myths was the truth of a man, one who wrestled with deep sorrow, who battled depression, who often doubted himself, yet never lost sight of what was right. He wasn't born believing he was extraordinary, and yet somehow, through courage and quiet persistence, he changed the course of history. Lincoln didn't live to see the full fruits of his labor. He never saw the painful years of Reconstruction or the long, turbulent struggle for civil rights that would unfold more than a century later. But the seeds he planted in his speeches, his laws, and his vision continued to grow. He reminded America not to aim for perfection, but for progress. Not to remain divided, but to find unity. Not to be ruled by hatred or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today, we remember Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, a leader who wielded both strength and gentleness. Yet what truly made him great wasn't just what he achieved, it was who he was. A boy who read by candlelight, a lawyer who valued honesty, a leader who never lost his humanity. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from purpose, from integrity, and from a heart that refuses to turn away from what is just. In that sense, Abraham Lincoln still lives, not only in monuments or history books, but in the ideals he shaped and the quiet strength he left behind. Now, as our story moves from the 19th century into a time far older, we turn our attention to another world entirely, a world of sea winds, legends and warriors. To many, the word Viking brings to mind fierce warriors in horned helmets, storming villages with axes raised high. But the truth, as history often reminds us, is far more complex and far more fascinating. The Vikings were not one people or a single empire. They were Norsemen, seafaring tribes from what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, living between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. To themselves, they were not Vikings at all. The word Viking was a verb, not a name. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. They were farmers and fishermen, blacksmiths and storytellers. They raised goats, harvested wheat, built wooden halls, and worshipped gods like Odin and Thor. They believed that fate itself was woven by the Norns, mysterious beings who watched over every soul. Most Norsemen weren't warriors. They were workers, resilient, resourceful, and bound to the land. But when the winters were long, when the fjords froze, and when hunger pressed hard, many took to the sea. They didn't raid out of cruelty. They sought survival, opportunity, and glory. Their world was one of harsh winters and fleeting summers, where life demanded adaptability and courage. Their curiosity was endless. They sailed waters others feared, explored unknown lands, and met cultures far beyond their own. Some became merchants, traveling down the rivers of Eastern Europe to trade with the Byzantines. Others settled in places like Ireland, France, and Russia. To those they attacked, they were seen as monsters. But to themselves they were explorers, pioneers carving out a place in a world that offered them little. It's easy to paint them only as raiders, but their story is richer, deeper, and far more human. Before we follow them across oceans and into legend, we must remember, the Vikings were not demons. They were men. Men who dreamed, who built, who fought, and who would soon reshape the world. If the Vikings had one unmatched advantage, it was their ships. Long, sleek, and elegant, the Viking longship was far more than a vessel. It was freedom itself. Crafted from oak with overlapping planks sealed by tar and animal hair, the ships were strong yet flexible, able to glide over waves instead of resisting them. Each longship could carry between 40 and 60 warriors, along with supplies and tools. But what made them truly fearsome was their adaptability. They could sail across the open sea or slip silently into shallow rivers. They could travel in barely a meter of water, strike deep inland, and vanish before anyone could respond. They didn't need harbors, only a stretch of sand or a rocky shore. And often, by the time villagers saw the sails on the horizon, the Vikings were already ashore. Many ships carried dragon or serpent carvings on their bows, meant to frighten both enemies and evil spirits. When the longships appeared, their sails full and their oars flashing in rhythm, the sight alone inspired terror. Across Europe, a longship on the horizon became a nightmare made real. It meant chaos was coming, swift and unstoppable. Yet not all Viking ships were built for war. Some were merchant vessels, wider and deeper for trade. Others were meant for exploration, sailing west to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The longship was more than a machine. It was the beating heart of the Viking Age. It gave them the power to escape, to discover, to conquer, and to dream. The world first truly took notice of the Vikings on a quiet summer day in 793 CE on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England. For years, monks had lived there in peace, copying manuscripts and tending to their sheep. It was a sanctuary of faith and learning. Then the ships appeared, sleek and silent on the horizon. The monks had no warning, no defenses, no understanding of what was coming. Within moments, the quiet island was overrun. The monastery burned. The treasures of gold and silver were carried away. Some monks were killed, others enslaved. It wasn't just a raid, it was a shock to the world. The people of Christian Europe believed their holy sites were under divine protection. But now their faith was shaken. The chronicles of the time recorded the fear in trembling words. The wrath of the Northmen is upon us. To the English, the Vikings were demons. But to the Vikings, it was opportunity, wealth and survival waiting across the sea. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Raids spread across England, Ireland, and France, hitting monasteries and towns alike. They came fast, struck hard, and vanished. But as the years went on, something remarkable happened. The Vikings stopped leaving. They began to settle. They built homes, markets, and families. Towns like Dublin and Wexford began as Viking camps, growing into thriving cities. In northern England, they carved out territories known as the Danelaw, where Norse laws and customs mixed with local traditions. The raiders had become residents. The destroyers had become builders, and the story of the Vikings, like that of Abraham Lincoln before them, became not just one of conquest but of transformation. The Norse influence spread far beyond the cold northern seas. In England, vast territories fell under Norse control, regions where Viking law replaced English rule. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became strongholds of Norse power, their harbours echoing with the language of the North. Even in the lands that would one day become Russia, the Vikings left their mark. Known there as the Rus, they navigated the great rivers, ruling over Slavic towns and founding trade centres that would grow into cities such as Kiev. But one of the most remarkable transformations took place in France. In 911, a Viking chieftain named Rollo struck an unexpected deal with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. For years, Rollo's fleet had raided the northern coasts of France, attacking along the river Seine. The Frankish kingdom had grown weary of the constant fighting, so instead of endless war, the king offered peace him and land. Rollo accepted, and the territory became known as Normandy, meaning land of the Northmen. Here, Viking culture began to blend with Frankish traditions. The Norsemen settled, adopted Christianity, learned new languages and became skilled farmers. Their descendants, within just a few generations, were no longer purely Viking nor purely Frankish. They were something in between. The spirit of the North had taken root in new soil. This transformation repeated itself across the Viking world. The same hands that once wielded axes began to till fields. The same ships that had carried raiders now transported grain, wool, and tools. The sword slowly gave way to the plough. Viking settlers married into local families, learned new tongues, and sometimes abandoned their old gods for new faiths. They didn't merely invade. They evolved, adapting to the lands they touched. Behind the popular image of wild raiders lay a deeper truth. The Vikings were not just destroyers of kingdoms, but founders of them. To understand them fully, one must understand what they believed, for behind every voyage, every battle cry, and every final breath on a distant shore stood a faith that shaped their world. The Norse believed that life was woven by fate, literally. In their mythology, 3 mysterious sisters known as the Norns sat beneath the great world tree Yggdrasil, spinning the destinies of gods and men alike. To them, nothing happened by chance. Every triumph, every fall, every storm and calm at sea was part of a grand design. At the heart of this cosmic tapestry stood Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and poetry. He had sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for knowledge, forever seeking truth and understanding. His restless pursuit mirrored that of the Vikings themselves, explorers driven by curiosity and courage. Beside him stood Thor, the thunder god, protector of gods and humans. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, he struck down chaos and evil, riding through the skies with thunder at his heels. Many Vikings wore small hammer pendants, as symbols of strength, protection, and faith. Then there was Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and battle. She received half of the fallen warriors in her own shining hall, while the rest went to Valhalla, Odin's majestic hall of the slain. To the Vikings, death in battle was not an end but an honor. To fall with courage meant to rise again in glory. To feast, fight, and prepare for the final battle at the world's end. To die without honor, however, was the greatest misfortune of all. This belief gave the Vikings their fearlessness. They faced danger with calm resolve, knowing that a glorious death was a passage to eternity. Their myths were not simply stories. They were guides on how to live, with pride, purpose, and bravery in the face of life's storms. But over time, myth became legend, and legend became misunderstanding. One of the most enduring images of the Viking is that of a fierce warrior with a horned helmet, tall, bearded, and terrifying. Yet this image is pure invention. No horned Viking helmets have ever been found. None appear in carvings, writings, or artwork from their time. The real Viking helmets were simple, functional, and made of iron, designed for protection, not display. So where did the horned helmet myth come from? It began much later, in the 1800s, during Europe's romantic fascination with ancient heroism. When composer Richard Wagner wrote his famous operas about Norse gods and warriors, stage designers added horned helmets to create a more dramatic appearance. Theatrical, grand, and visually striking, they became symbols of wild power. The image stuck, spreading through art, literature, and eventually Hollywood. In truth, real Viking warriors would have laughed at the idea. Horns would have caught on weapons or doorways, made helmets heavy and impractical. The Norse valued utility above all. Their gear was built for survival, not spectacle. Yet even so, they infused their tools and weapons with artistry. Their swords bore intricate knotwork. Their ships displayed dragon carvings, meant to ward off spirits. Their jewelry carried symbols of gods and legends. They were practical, but never without meaning. And though the horned helmet remains a modern fantasy, the reality is no less impressive. The Vikings didn't need horns to inspire fear. They had skill, discipline, and a quiet determination that spoke louder than any ornament could. The Viking story is not only one of raids and conquests, it is also one of exploration. While much of Europe saw the sea as a boundary, the Norse saw it as a pathway. Their world was full of limitations: scarce farmland, harsh winters, crowded fjords, and the ocean was the escape. With their unmatched longships, they ventured further than anyone before them. They sailed west to the British Isles, then to Ireland and Scotland, eventually discovering the Faroe Islands and the vast windswept lands of Iceland. By the late 9th century, Norse families had built homes there, founded farms, and even formed the world's first parliamentary assembly, the Althing. But for some, even Iceland wasn't far enough. The exiled chieftain Eric the Red set sail westward and found a massive icy land. He named it Greenland, hoping the pleasant name would attract settlers. And it did. Then came his son, Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, Leif journeyed even farther and discovered a land covered in forests and wild grapes. The Norse called it Vanland, believed today to be part of Newfoundland, Canada. There they built small settlements, the first known European presence in North America, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The Norse presence in Vinland was short-lived, ended by harsh winters, long distances, and conflict with the native peoples. But the spirit of that journey, the courage to cross into the unknown, defined the Viking soul. For generations, they explored the rivers of Eastern Europe, traded with the Byzantine Empire, and traveled through deserts and forests in search of fortune and discovery. They did not always know what awaited them, but they went anyway. No age lasts forever. By the middle of the 11th century, the Viking era was drawing to a close. The raids slowed. The longships carried traders instead of warriors. The old pagan gods gave way to Christianity. Kings and chieftains converted, seeking peace and stability with their Christian neighbors. The world the Vikings had shaped through exploration and courage began to settle into kingdoms: Denmark, Norway and Sweden, nations built on the bones of the past. The age of the Vikings had ended, but their spirit, bold, curious, unyielding, continued to sail through time, carried by the wind and remembered in story. As the centuries turned, the Viking world began to change. Local chieftains who once ruled with freedom and force were replaced by the steady hand of kings and royal law. The wild independence that had defined Viking life slowly gave way to structure and order. Raiding, once the heartbeat of Norse ambition, was replaced by taxes and trade. Across Europe, defenses strengthened. Stone castles rose along the coasts, and towns built walls to protect themselves. The element of surprise, which had long been the Vikings' greatest weapon, began to disappear. The world had grown smaller and more guarded, and for the first time, it was harder for the Vikings to thrive. One of the final great chapters of the Viking Age came in 1066. A powerful Norse king, Harald Hardrada, set sail for England with dreams of reclaiming a crown. His army fought bravely at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but the English forces prevailed, and Hardrada fell in battle. Only weeks later, another invasion swept across England, this time led by William, Duke of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings. But William did not come as a raider. He came as a conqueror and became king. The Viking Age had come full circle, from sea-born invaders to crowned rulers, from the chaos of raids to the order of empires, and then slowly the sails faded from the horizon. The longships that had once terrified the world slipped quietly into history. Though their raids ended, the legacy of the Vikings remained, carved into the landscapes, languages, and very bloodlines of Europe. Their mark can still be found in the rugged independence of Iceland, in the stones engraved with ancient runes, and in the place names that echo their presence across England and beyond. The Viking Age had passed, but their spirit, one bold, curious, and unyielding, continued to live beneath the surface of our shared history. Today, their ships rest in museums and burial mounds, their sails long gone, their oars still, and yet their influence moves quietly through time. The Vikings never built vast marble cities or towering empires, but their impact is carved deep into the foundations of the modern world. In England, over 1,000 towns and villages still carry Norse names. Everyday words like knife, sky, window, and berserk come directly from the Old Norse tongue. Even the days of the week still whisper their memory. Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Freya. The gods of the north still mark the rhythm of our modern lives. In Ireland, cities such as Dublin were founded by Norse settlers, first as raiding outposts, later as bustling trade centres, and eventually as thriving medieval cities. In France, the descendants of Viking settlers became the Normans, who reshaped European history through war, conquest, and rule. Their greatest moment came in 1066, when William the Conqueror claimed the English crown, forever changing the destiny of Europe. And in Iceland, the Viking tongue still lives. The Icelandic language remains so close to Old Norse that the ancient sagas, written centuries ago by firelight, can still be read aloud and understood. These sagas preserve not only stories but a worldview of courage, endurance, and the human struggle to find meaning in a harsh and beautiful world. But the Viking legacy is not confined to the past. It breathes in our culture, in books, films, music, and art. Their tales continue to inspire, sometimes through myth, sometimes through truth. The idea of facing the storm, of pushing beyond fear and into the unknown, that is the real spirit of the North. We remember the Vikings, not just for their ferocity, but for their humanity. They were explorers, poets, traders, and dreamers, men and women who lived fully in a world that demanded both strength and sacrifice. They were mothers and fathers, rulers and wanderers, storytellers and seekers. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but its waves still reach our shores, soft but steady, carrying echoes of adventure and resilience. The sea was never the end of their world. For the Vikings it was only ever the beginning, and as the tides of history turn once more, our story now drifts across oceans and centuries, from the cold northern fjords to the heart of another great empire that rose from water, the city of Tenochtitlan, jewel of the Aztecs. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, There stood a city that defied imagination. Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, seemed to rise from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a dream. Built upon islands and connected by great causeways, it shimmered with symmetry, stone, and purpose. Founded in 1325, legend tells that the Aztecs were guided by a divine prophecy to find an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. When they saw this vision on a swampy lakebed, they built their empire there, stone by stone, canal by canal. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan had become one of the largest cities in the world, home to more than 200,000 people. Wide avenues crossed bustling canals, white temples gleamed beneath the sun, and markets overflowed with color, trade, and life. At the city's heart stood the Templo Mayor, a great double pyramid that reached toward the heavens. One side was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and the other to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Here the Aztecs offered prayers, gifts, and at times blood, to maintain the delicate balance between earth and sky. The Aztec world was ordered and hierarchical. Nobles, priests, merchants, and warriors all had their place, and tribute poured in from every direction: cacao, feathers, jade, obsidian, maize, and gold. At the pinnacle stood Montezuma Sioux, emperor and divine ruler, wise yet cautious, a man who believed the gods spoke through omens and dreams. But beneath the empire's grandeur lay tension. Many neighboring peoples resented Aztec dominance, their taxes, their sacrifices, their unrelenting control. And far beyond the mountains, across an ocean unknown to the Aztecs, ships were sailing westward. They carried new weapons, strange beliefs, and an insatiable hunger for gold and glory. In 1519, a fleet of 11 ships arrived on the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula. From them stepped Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador with no royal title, no grand army, and no permission to conquer, only a fierce ambition and a dangerous kind of faith. He brought with him 500 soldiers, a few cannons, 16 horses, and the unshakable belief that God and destiny were on his side. As the Spaniards pushed inland, they faced fierce resistance, but also found unexpected allies. Many native peoples, long oppressed by Aztec rule, saw an opportunity for liberation. Cortés fought when he had to, but he also negotiated, manipulating politics and fear in equal measure. Along the way, he gained a crucial companion, a native woman known as Malintzin or La Malinche. Gifted with intelligence and fluent in multiple languages, she became his translator, his cultural bridge, and eventually his closest confidant. Through her, he learned how to speak to the people, and how to turn their divisions to his advantage. As he marched westward, rumors spread of a vast empire in the highlands, of temples of gold, of gods and kings. The Spaniards' desire grew, and so did the Aztecs' unease. Montezuma heard reports of pale-skinned strangers with beards, dressed in metal, riding beasts no one had ever seen. Some said they were gods returning from the east. Others feared they were harbingers of doom. On November 8, 1519, the two worlds finally met. Hernán Cortés, armored and determined, stood face to face with Montezuma II, the divine emperor draped in gold and feathers. It was not simply a meeting between two men. It was the collision of civilizations. When the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan, they were awestruck. The city gleamed with white stone and turquoise water, cleaner and more magnificent than any in Europe. For a moment, they believed they had stepped into a vision. Montezuma welcomed them not with swords, but with ceremony, gifts of gold, fine cloaks, and the cautious grace of a ruler who sensed that history itself was watching, and it was. Montezuma welcomed Cortés not with hostility, but with words of peace. He offered the Spaniard lodging in one of the royal palaces, surrounding him with all the honor due to a foreign dignitary. According to Spanish accounts, Montezuma even bowed to him, a gesture whose meaning remains uncertain. To Montezuma, it may have been a display of respect or an ancient ritual of greeting. To the Spaniards, it looked like submission. Between the two worlds, separated by faith, culture, and language, meaning was already beginning to fracture. The emperor faced an impossible moment. Strange omens had troubled him for months, lightning striking the temples, visions of fire in the sky, and rumors of pale-faced men arriving from the east. His priests whispered, that these signs heralded the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god said to one day return from the sea. Montezuma was thoughtful and cautious. Perhaps he believed that diplomacy was the only way to prevent disaster, or perhaps he simply wanted to understand these strangers before acting against them. Whatever his reasoning, he chose peace over war. But to Hernán Cortés, this welcome was not a gesture of friendship. It was a sign of weakness. He saw not ceremony but opportunity, not reverence but surrender. Where Montezuma saw sacred hospitality, Cortés saw a kingdom ripe for conquest. Their conversations were a maze of mistranslation. Every sentence passed through several tongues, from Nahuatl to Mayan to Spanish, words layered with ritual and nuance. Respect was mistaken for fear, diplomacy for submission. The Aztecs believed they were maintaining balance. The Spaniards believed they had gained control. Between these two misread truths, the seeds of tragedy began to take root. For a time, the Spaniards were treated as honored guests in Tenochtitlan. They lived in a grand palace, feasted on fine food, and roamed the magnificent city freely. Cortés admired its beauty, its order, its astonishing size. But behind his fascination was calculation. He understood that he was surrounded by thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, who could end him in a single night if Montezuma gave the command. So he acted first. With cold precision, Cortés placed Montezuma under house arrest. It was not a violent seizure. The emperor still wore his gold, still held court, but guards now stood at his door and his freedom quietly vanished. The Spaniards believed that by holding Montezuma, they held the empire itself. For a brief moment, that illusion seemed to work. The emperor remained calm, perhaps resigned, perhaps still hoping to avoid the unthinkable. Some say he believed the Spaniards would one day leave. Others say he had begun to doubt the gods themselves. Even as a prisoner, Montezuma addressed his people from the palace roof, asking for peace. He told them the strangers meant no harm, urging patience and restraint. But outside the palace walls, tension grew like a rising storm. The people whispered, then shouted. They accused their emperor of betrayal. He had welcomed invaders into their sacred city, allowed them to stay, allowed them to rule. The man who once commanded gods and armies now appeared powerless before the foreigners. Cortés felt the shift as well. His alliance with Montezuma was crumbling, and the fragile peace that held the city together began to break apart. Still, no blood had been spilled within the capital. There was perhaps a chance to end things peacefully. But that hope would soon die, in a single act of cruelty that no one could take back. While Cortés marched to the coast to confront a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, he left Pedro de Alvarado in command of the city. Alvarado was a soldier, not a diplomat. Where Cortés relied on cunning, Alvarado relied on fear. During Cortés's absence, the Aztecs prepared for Toxcatl, one of their most sacred festivals, honoring Tezcatlipoca, Lord of the Night and Fate. The city filled with color and music as priests, nobles and warriors gathered at the great temple courtyard, dressed in gold and feathers. It was a celebration of rhythm, life, and faith, but to Alvarado, the sight of so many armed men and powerful nobles gathering together looked like rebellion. He claimed to have heard whispers of an uprising. Whether those rumors were real or imagined, his paranoia took hold. He decided to act first. As the festival reached its height and drums thundered through the night, Spanish soldiers sealed the exits to the courtyard. Then, without warning, they drew their swords. They struck down unarmed dancers, priests, and nobles, slashing through the crowd with steel and fury. Blood poured across the temple stones. The music stopped. Cries of joy turned into screams. What followed was not battle, it was massacre. When Cortés returned days later, he found a city on the brink of chaos. The Aztecs, once curious and cautious, were now consumed by rage. The illusion of peace had been destroyed forever. The Spanish quarters were surrounded, the causeways blocked, supplies cut off. Tenochtitlan had become a cage, stone walls on one side, deep water on the other. Inside, Montezuma remained a captive. His words no longer calmed his people. His voice no longer carried weight. The empire that had worshipped him as a god no longer listened to the man behind the mask. The old balance between ruler and ruled, between gods and men, had collapsed. Cortés tried desperately to regain control. He spoke with Montezuma, pleaded with him to restore peace, offered gifts and promises, but the city's heart had already broken. The massacre at the temple had desecrated everything sacred. Blood had been spilled on holy ground, and the gods themselves, the people believed, demanded vengeance. The Spaniards were trapped, hungry, cornered, their allies dying, their options dwindling. Cortés made one last attempt at diplomacy. He brought Montezuma to the palace rooftop, hoping the emperor could calm his people. Instead, they answered with fury. Stones and spears flew through the air. One struck Montezuma in the head. Within days, he was dead, silent, still, and mourned by few. His death shattered the final bridge between the two worlds. On the night of June 30th, 1520, under a moonless, rain-soaked sky, Cortés made his escape. His soldiers and native allies crept through the dark, carrying what they could, supplies, weapons, and far too much gold. Greed slowed them. The narrow causeways that led out of the city became death traps. From canoes and rooftops, Aztec warriors rained arrows and spears on the fleeing invaders. Many Spaniards slipped from the slick stones into the lake, dragged down by the weight of their stolen treasure. Others were captured alive and sacrificed on the same pyramids they had once admired. The screams and clash of steel echoed through the rain. By dawn, only a few survived. Cortés collapsed beneath a tree on the far shore, soaked, bloodied, and broken. He wept. That night would be remembered forever as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of native allies lay dead. The dream of conquest seemed lost, but it was not the end. The survivors limped away to regroup. More native allies, united by their hatred of Aztec domination, joined them. Though battered and beaten, Cortés still had his guns, his steel, and his unshakable resolve. The night of sorrows had passed. But the storm was far from over. Something unseen had already entered Tenochtitlan, silent, invisible, and far deadlier than any sword or cannon. While the clash of steel echoed through the city and the causeways ran red, a single infected man carried with him the most devastating weapon of all: disease. Smallpox had arrived, and it would finish what warfare could not. As the Spaniards mourned their dead and rebuilt their strength, an invisible enemy spread through the heart of the Aztec Empire. It came quietly, riding on breath and skin, carried by a single enslaved man who had traveled with the Spanish. At first, no one noticed. A fever here, a cough there, a rash mistaken for something ordinary. But soon the sickness consumed the city. Tenochtitlan, once alive with music, color, and movement, fell eerily silent. Whole families died within days. Children, priests, warriors, all struck down without warning. The dead filled homes and temples. The living, too weak to bury them, abandoned the bodies to the sun and the lake. The Aztecs had no name for this kind of death. Their healers were powerless, their gods offered no comfort, and prayers went unanswered. Panic turned to despair. In just a few months, as much as half the city's population was gone, not by battle but by plague. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's brother and successor. His rule had lasted only 80 days. The empire, broken and desperate, turned to a new leader, Cuauhtémoc, a young noble known for his courage and fierce spirit. But while the Aztecs buried their dead, Cortés returned, stronger than ever. He now commanded more than 100,000 native allies, including the fierce Tlaxcalans, who saw in the Spaniards a chance to destroy their ancient enemies. For many indigenous tribes, the Aztecs had been ruthless overlords. Now revenge gave them purpose. In May of 1521, Cortés began the final siege of Tenochtitlan. He cut off the causeways leading into the city, isolating it from the mainland. Then, on the lake, he launched brigantine ships, floating fortresses built to control the waters and block all supplies. The once bustling capital was trapped. The siege dragged on for months. Day after day, street by street, the Spaniards and their allies fought their way through the city. The Aztecs, starving and sick, refused to surrender. They fought from rooftops and canals, turning temples into fortresses and markets into battlegrounds. Every inch of ground was earned in blood, but disease and hunger did what swords could not. By the final weeks, Tenochtitlan was no longer the shining city Cortés had first entered in awe. It was a wasteland of ash and ruin, its canals clogged with corpses, its temples scarred by fire. The floating gardens withered, the air thick with smoke and decay. For 93 days the Aztecs resisted, starving but unbroken. Their young emperor Cuauhtémoc refused to yield. Even as the people collapsed from exhaustion, he believed their cause was sacred, that the gods demanded courage, even in defeat. But the Spanish siege was merciless. Their cannons shattered walls, their ships dominated the lake, and their native allies swarmed the streets. No help came. No miracle arrived. And on August 13, 1521, the fighting ended. Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to escape by canoe. When brought before Cortés, he stood tall and unafraid. "I have done my duty in defense of my people," he said. "Now I am your prisoner. Take this dagger and kill me." Cortés refused, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of pride. The city, however, was gone. Tenochtitlan, once home to more than 200,000 souls, lay in ruins. Temples were looted, sacred manuscripts destroyed, and survivors enslaved or left to starve. The great lake that had cradled the city was drained and filled. Upon its bones, Cortés began to build Mexico City, the capital of a new world rising over the ashes of the old. But something within the Spaniards had also died. The awe they once felt for the city's beauty had turned to emptiness. The conquest was complete, but the silence that followed was heavy, filled with ghosts, with smoke, with the unbearable weight of what they had destroyed. The Aztec Empire was no more. Its temples lay in fragments beneath stone and asphalt. Its kings were gone. Its gods, once worshipped by flame and song, had fallen silent. Yet even in ruin, something endured. You can still hear it in the language. Nahuatl, the tongue of the Aztecs, is still spoken by over 1 million people in Mexico today. Words like chocolate, tomato, avocado, and coyote, echoes of an ancient world, still roll off modern tongues. You can still see it in the art, carvings of eagles, serpents, and suns, patterns that once adorned temples now inspire painters, sculptors, and craftsmen. You can taste it in the food, maize, chili, and cacao, once sacred to the Aztecs, now woven into cuisines across the globe, and you can feel it in the people, the descendants of the Mexica and other Nahua peoples who walk the streets of Mexico today. Their features, crafts, and stories carry the blood memory of an empire that never truly died. The Spaniards built their churches and palaces over the ruins, but they could not erase the soul beneath. The conquest was swift, brutal, and absolute, but not complete. The Aztec spirit survived, transformed but unbroken. Indigenous traditions adapted, merged with the new, and found ways to live on in festivals, prayers, and quiet rituals passed down through generations. The fall of the Aztec Empire is remembered as a tragedy, a clash of worlds, a collision of greed, faith, and fate. But it is also a story of resilience. For all the gold stolen, for all the blood spilled, the conquerors could not take the memory. They could not silence the volcanoes that still watch over the valley. They could not erase the songs, the colors, the heartbeat of a people who refused to disappear. Even now, beneath the grand cathedrals and busy streets of Mexico City, the stones of ancient temples remain, silent, watching, eternal. Time may have buried the empire, but its heart still beats beneath the earth, within the people, and in the stories we continue to tell. They read their letters aloud to one another, passing them around, sharing in each other's joy and heartbreak. For a moment, those fragile pieces of paper reminded them of home, of warmth, of life before the mud. But sometimes a letter came too late. Mail could take weeks, even months. And there were times when a letter arrived after its intended reader had already fallen in battle. In those moments, his comrades would gather quietly, open the envelope with care, and read it aloud in his memory. One last echo of a life cut short. In a war ruled by machinery and madness, where men became statistics and loss was measured in thousands, these letters were proof of something still human. They were bridges between two worlds, one of peace, one of war, as carrying love, fear, hope, and longing. In a place where nothing was certain, a single letter could save a man's spirit. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, the first winter of a war that many had thought would be over by now. The trenches were frozen and heavy with frost. Soldiers huddled beneath damp blankets, thinking of their homes, their families, and the warmth of peace. Then, across the darkness of no man's land, came an unexpected sound. Faint at first, then clear. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night, holy night. German voices sang softly into the cold air. British troops listened, unsure at first, then slowly joined in with their own carols. One by one, Heads began to rise above the parapets. What followed became one of the most human moments in a deeply inhuman war. Without orders, without permission, soldiers began to climb out of their trenches. They met in the middle of no man's land, that deadly stretch of mud and wire, and shook hands. They exchanged buttons, chocolate, cigarettes, and even bits of food. Someone found a football, and soon laughter echoed across the battlefield as they kicked it back and forth, boots sliding through snow and mud. There were no teams, no sides, no score, just men laughing under a cold winter sky. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. They buried their dead together. They lit candles and sang songs in languages neither could understand. For a few precious hours there was no war, no enemy, only men who wanted peace. But peace could not last. When the generals heard of the truce, they were furious. Orders came down forbidding any further contact. The next day the guns roared again. Artillery thundered. Snipers returned to their posts. The soldiers who had embraced the night before went back to killing each other. The Christmas truce was never repeated on such a scale. But for those who lived it, the memory never faded. It was a flicker of light in a world of darkness, proof that beneath every uniform beat a human heart, capable of compassion even in hell. It did not end the war, but it showed that for one night, peace didn't need to be declared by generals. It was chosen by soldiers with frozen hands and open hearts. The noise of war is unforgettable, the scream of shells, the rattle of machine guns, the crack of a sniper's bullet. But what many soldiers remembered most was the silence. Between the bombardments there were long, empty hours where nothing happened. No movement, no orders, just the heavy, suffocating stillness of waiting. It was in that silence that the true war began. Men sat with their thoughts. Some wrote letters, some smoked until their hands shook. Others stared at the wooden walls, listening for sounds in the dark. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was tense, unnatural, thick enough to feel. Any sound, a cough, a twig snapping, a whisper, could mean danger. At night the fear deepened. Flares drifted like ghosts above the trenches, casting pale light across the barbed wire. Men whispered, afraid even of their own voices. Every hour brought the same question. Is this the night they come? Sometimes the silence broke without warning. An artillery shell, a sudden raid, a cry in the dark, and then, just as suddenly, the quiet returned, heavier than before. Between the chaos, soldiers repaired trenches, buried their dead, brewed weak tea, and told stories to keep their sanity. The stillness offered no rest, only reflection. In that reflection, fear grew deep roots. Men counted their breaths, their days, their chances. They listened to their own heartbeat, as if it were the last sound they'd ever hear, and yet they stayed. Not for glory or heroism, but because the trench had become the only world they knew. Between the barrages, time slowed. The war paused, but never stopped. In those endless, hollow hours, the human spirit learned to endure not through peace, but through quiet survival. Then came the gas. The first attack arrived like a strange green mist, moving low across the battlefield, curling through the craters and wire like something alive. There was no sound, no explosion, only a slow, creeping fog. At first the soldiers stared, confused. Then came the coughing. It was April 1915 near Ypres, Belgium, when the Germans released chlorine gas for the first time. The cloud drifted toward the Allied trenches, and by the time the men understood what was happening, it was too late. The gas burned the eyes and throat, seared the lungs, and left even the strongest choking for air. Panic spread faster than the poison itself. Some men soaked cloths in urine and held them to their faces, desperate for protection. Later came phosgene, deadlier still, and then mustard gas, which clung to the ground, blistered the skin, blinded the eyes, and stayed in the soil for weeks. It didn't just kill. It maimed, scarred, and haunted. Soon soldiers were issued gas masks, eerie contraptions of rubber and glass that made them look like creatures from another world. They helped, but not always in time. In darkness or chaos, a few seconds' delay could mean death. Even when there was no gas, fear remained. A strange smell, a shift in the wind, and men would scramble for their masks, hearts pounding. The gas became a ghost, a silent killer that invaded their dreams. It changed the very nature of the war, turning the air itself into an enemy. The trenches became suffocating tombs, and death became impersonal. Not from a bullet, not from bravery, but from a single breath. Even those who survived were forever changed. Their lungs scarred, Their voices cracked, their sleep haunted. But amid the mud, the wire, and the constant threat of death, there was one thing that made life in the trenches bearable: each other. Comradeship became more than friendship, it was survival. When everything else was stripped away, medals, ranks, even hope, what remained were men, cold and frightened, clinging to the sound of a familiar voice nearby. They came from everywhere: farmers, teachers, miners, sons. Most had never left their hometowns before the war. But in the trenches, all differences disappeared. They shared everything: cigarettes, blankets, rations, even their fears. One man's dry socks became another's salvation. One soldier's joke kept the whole section sane. Together they endured. And in that bond, forged in mud and fire, they found what no weapon could destroy: the stubborn will to keep going. They passed down what they called trench law, the unwritten rules of survival. Which dugout stayed the driest after rain? Which officer you could trust? How to brew the strongest cup of tea over a candle flame? When the shelling stopped, even for a few precious minutes, the men would gather, mugs in hand, steam rising from chipped enamel cups filled with weak, gritty tea made from boiled rainwater. These moments were sacred. They told jokes, some crude, some clever, others so old they'd been passed between battalions like family heirlooms. They sang songs that reminded them of home, the kind that made them forget for a moment where they were. Sometimes they played cards. Other times they just sat quietly, thankful for the silence, the warmth, the company. They spoke of things beyond the war: sweethearts, sisters, favorite meals. Summer days that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Some planned for the future, what they'd build, where they'd go, who they'd marry. Others didn't speak at all. They just listened, letting their friends' voices carry them away, even if only in their imagination. And when one of them didn't return, it wasn't just a name on a casualty list. It was a missing laugh, a silent seat in the circle, a space no one could fill. In a war filled with loss, it was these small human connections that kept men alive. It wasn't medals, orders, or glory that held them in the trenches. It was the bond between brothers, forged not in fire but in frost, in laughter, and in the simple comfort of a hot drink passed from hand to hand. But night in the trenches was a different kind of terror. The darkness didn't bring rest, it brought uncertainty. It blurred the line between what was real and what was imagined. Shadows stretched long across no man's land. The sky, once full of clouds and birds, now held only silence and the pale flare of burning magnesium drifting through the cold air. Every sound mattered: a footstep, a shovel scraping earth, the sharp click of a rifle bolt. Each one could mean an enemy patrol, a raid, or worse. Soldiers took turns standing guard, motionless, eyes scanning the black horizon, hearts pounding in their chests. A single mistake could mean death: a flash of a match, the glow of a cigarette, a whispered word too loud. Sleep, when it came, was short and uneasy. They slept in their boots, rifles by their sides, in dugouts barely wide enough to roll over in. Dreams, when they came, were filled with thunder and smoke. Many learned not to dream at all. The cold crept into their bones. Blankets were damp, and bodies pressed together for warmth. But even then fear lingered. Some nights were deadly, others were eerily quiet, and that silence could be just as dangerous. In those calm stretches the mind began to play tricks. Was that movement beyond the wire? A whisper in the wind? Men exchanged looks, unsure what they'd heard. Orders were passed softly. Patrols crept out in small groups, moving through no man's land like ghosts, laying wire, scouting, or simply reminding the enemy they weren't alone. Letters were written under flickering candles. Some were filled with love, others with quiet goodbyes, never labeled as such but written with the knowledge that it might be their last. The night asked questions the day was too loud to ask. Will I survive? Will anyone remember me? And yet when morning came, when that pale light rose over the wreckage, the men were still there, cold, tired, but alive. In the trenches every sunrise was a victory. Not every wound came from bullets or shrapnel. Some were quieter, hidden beneath the surface. The trenches didn't just break bodies, and they broke spirits. Each day chipped away at something: strength, hope, sanity. For many, the greatest cost of war wasn't dying, it was surviving. Trench foot turned skin white, then black until it rotted away. Men lost toes, even feet. Lice burrowed into uniforms, causing endless itching and spreading disease. Rats grew fat on crumbs and corpses. But the unseen wounds cut deepest, what they called shell shock, what we now know as PTSD. Men returned home unable to speak, unable to sleep, flinching at every loud sound. Some were haunted by nightmares that never let go. Back then, commanders called it cowardice, weakness. But it wasn't. These men weren't fragile, they were human. Their minds had been shaken by years of terror, by the endless noise, by what they had seen and done. And then there were the dead who couldn't be reached. Bodies left out in no man's land, too dangerous to retrieve, too sacred to forget. They lay there, silent witnesses to every advance and retreat. Each one a reminder of the cost. The emotional toll was immense. Survivors carried guilt like a shadow. Guilt for living when others hadn't. Others felt nothing at all, their hearts buried under layers of grief and mud. Even rest brought no peace. When soldiers went home on leave, the quiet of normal life was unbearable. They couldn't talk about what they'd seen, and those who hadn't been there couldn't understand. The war changed them, not just how they looked, but how they thought, how they felt, how they lived. The guns might fall silent, but the echoes carried on, deep inside. The trenches had consumed more than flesh. They had devoured memories, laughter, and youth itself. Then at last the guns did fall silent. November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The war to end all wars was finally over, but silence did not mean peace. Along the Western Front, soldiers emerged slowly from their trenches, not quite believing it was real. Some wept, some stood frozen, and some just stared across no man's land, wondering if the enemy, those men who had tried to kill them, now felt the same strange emptiness. The trenches didn't disappear. They remained sunken into the mud, slowly reclaimed by the earth. Helmets, boots, rifles, letters, all left behind. Fragments of lives that once filled those narrow walls. The soldiers returned home, but they were not the same. The streets they knew felt different. The laughter of children felt distant. Many found comfort only in silence. Others were haunted by it. Some limped from visible wounds. Others carried scars no one could see. They spoke little of what happened. When they did, it was rarely about battles. It was about moments. A cup of tea shared in the cold. A letter that arrived just in time. A friend who didn't wake up. The trenches became history, photographed, mapped, studied. But for those who had lived in them, they were more than that. A second home, a cage, a graveyard, a place where youth was left behind forever. And yet, from that darkness, something resilient emerged. Memorials were built, poppies bloomed. New generations were born because others had endured. Today, in quiet fields once drenched in blood, the grass grows again. Birds sing. The wind whispers through the trees. The trenches have faded from the land, but not from memory, because in that silence, something sacred still remains. The voices of those who endured the unendurable, and proved that even in mud and madness, the human spirit can survive.